Corporal Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other recruits at Camp Pendleton. While most of the young Marines spent their evenings playing video games or hanging out at the local bars, Sarah could be found in the base library, studying military history or working on her correspondence courses. She had joined the Marines not for the adventure or the benefits, but because she genuinely believed in serving her country. Sarah came from a small town in Texas where her father had been a Vietnam veteran who never spoke about his service. Her mother worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. When Sarah announced her intention to join the Marines, her parents were both proud and terrified. They knew their daughter was strong-willed and determined, but the military was a tough world, especially for women. From the moment she arrived at boot camp, Sarah faced challenges that went beyond the physical demands of training. Some of her male counterparts questioned whether women belonged in the Marines at all. They would make snide comments about her abilities, suggest she was taking a spot that belonged to a man, or imply that she would crack under pressure when it mattered most. Sarah endured these comments with quiet dignity, focusing on proving herself through her actions rather than her words. Despite the hostility from some quarters, Sarah excelled in her training. She consistently scored among the top performers in her class, whether it was marksmanship, physical fitness, or tactical exercises. Her drill instructors recognized her potential and pushed her even harder, knowing she had what it took to be an exceptional Marine. Sarah's determination and skill gradually earned her the respect of many of her fellow recruits, though a core group remained hostile to her presence. After completing boot camp with honors, Sarah was assigned to a combat support unit. She had hoped for a frontline position, but military policy at the time restricted women from certain combat roles. She accepted her assignment with grace, understanding that she could still serve her country effectively in a support capacity. Her unit was responsible for logistics and supply operations, ensuring that frontline troops had everything they needed to complete their missions. Sarah's first deployment came sooner than expected. Tensions had escalated in a volatile region overseas, and her unit was called upon to support a major military operation. As their convoy prepared to depart the base for what should have been a routine supply run, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was what she had trained for, her chance to serve her country in a real combat zone. The convoy consisted of several armored vehicles carrying supplies and personnel to a forward operating base. Sarah was assigned as a gunner in one of the vehicles, responsible for providing security during the journey. She had practiced this role countless times during training, but doing it in a real combat environment where the threats were genuine felt completely different. Every shadow, every movement in the distance, every unusual sound could potentially be dangerous. The first part of the journey proceeded without incident. The convoy moved through relatively secure territory, following established routes that were regularly patrolled by coalition forces. Sarah maintained her vigilance, scanning the terrain through her weapon sight, looking for any signs of trouble. Her training had taught her to expect the unexpected, and she remained alert even when everything seemed calm and routine. As they entered a more contested area, the atmosphere in the vehicle became more tense. The other Marines stopped their casual conversation and focused intently on their surroundings. Sarah could feel her heart rate increase as she realized they were now in genuine danger. This was no longer a training exercise where mistakes could be corrected and lessons learned without serious consequences. Here, a moment of inattention or a poor decision could have deadly results. The attack came without warning, just as her instructors had said it would. One moment the convoy was moving steadily down a dusty road, and the next moment the lead vehicle erupted in flames as an improvised explosive device detonated beneath it. The blast was so powerful that Sarah felt her vehicle shake even though they were several hundred yards behind the lead vehicle. The sound was unlike anything she had experienced, a thunderous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Immediately after the initial explosion, small arms fire began raining down on the convoy from both sides of the road. The attackers had chosen their position well, placing the Marines in a deadly crossfire with limited options for cover or escape. Sarah's training took over as she began returning fire, trying to identify and eliminate the threats while her driver maneuvered their vehicle to a more defensible position. The firefight lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah fired her weapon with precision and discipline, just as she had been taught, while coordinating with the other members of her team. She could hear her squad leader shouting orders over the radio, calling for air support and medical evacuation for the casualties from the lead vehicle. The situation was chaotic and dangerous, but Sarah felt oddly calm, focused entirely on doing her job effectively. When the second explosion occurred, Sarah barely had time to register what was happening. Another improvised explosive device, this one much closer to her vehicle, detonated with tremendous force. The blast lifted the rear of their armored vehicle off the ground and sent it tumbling sideways off the road. Sarah felt herself being thrown around inside the vehicle like a rag doll, her safety harness straining against the forces acting on her body. The vehicle came to rest on its side in a shallow ditch beside the road. Sarah's ears were ringing so loudly that she could barely hear anything else. She tried to move and realized that something was seriously wrong with her left leg. When she looked down, she could see that her uniform was torn and bloody, and her leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The pain was intense, but adrenaline and shock were keeping her somewhat functional. Her squad mates were calling her name, trying to determine if she was conscious and able to move. Sarah managed to respond, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. The ringing in her ears was gradually subsiding, replaced by the sounds of ongoing gunfire and shouting. The attack was still in progress, and her team needed to get out of the exposed vehicle and find cover. With help from her teammates, Sarah managed to crawl out of the overturned vehicle. Every movement sent waves of pain through her injured leg, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Her fellow Marines helped her reach a defensive position behind some rocks where she could continue to contribute to the fight despite her injuries. She refused to be evacuated until the engagement was over and all her teammates were safe. The medical evacuation helicopter finally arrived after what seemed like an eternity. Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher and flown to a field hospital where doctors worked to stabilize her condition. The injuries to her leg were severe, requiring multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. But Sarah was alive, and she had proven to herself and her unit that she could perform under the most extreme circumstances. During her recovery, Sarah received numerous visitors from her unit. Most of them praised her courage and professionalism during the attack, acknowledging that her actions had helped save lives. However, a few Marines made comments that troubled her deeply. They suggested that her presence in the convoy had somehow made the unit more vulnerable, that the attackers had specifically targeted their vehicle because they knew a woman was aboard. These comments were particularly hurtful because Sarah had performed her duties exactly as she had been trained, showing no less courage or competence than her male counterparts. The suggestion that her gender rather than enemy tactics had caused the attack felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed for her country. But Sarah kept these feelings to herself, focusing instead on her physical recovery and her determination to return to active duty. The rehabilitation process was long and difficult. Sarah's leg had been badly damaged in the explosion, requiring multiple surgeries to repair the bones and soft tissue. The doctors warned her that she might never regain full mobility, and that her military career could be over. But Sarah refused to accept this prognosis, throwing herself into physical therapy with the same determination she had shown throughout her military service. Months passed as Sarah worked to rebuild her strength and mobility. The process was frustrating and painful, with setbacks and small victories along the way. Some days she made significant progress, and other days she felt like she was moving backward. The psychological challenges were almost as difficult as the physical ones, as she struggled with depression and anxiety about her future in the military. Eventually, Sarah recovered enough to return to limited duty. However, her injuries had left her with a permanent limp and ongoing pain that she tried hard to conceal. She knew that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by those who had always questioned her place in the Marines. So she learned to walk normally when others were watching, saving her pain medication for when she was alone, and never complaining about her discomfort. When Sarah returned to her unit, she found that attitudes toward her had shifted in complex ways. Some of her fellow Marines treated her with newfound respect, recognizing that she had proven herself under fire. Others seemed to view her injuries as confirmation of their belief that women were not suited for military service. And a third group treated her with a kind of awkward sympathy that she found almost as offensive as outright hostility. The months following Sarah's return to duty proved to be some of the most challenging of her military career. While she had expected some adjustment period, she was unprepared for the subtle but persistent campaign of harassment that began almost immediately. It started with small things that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding, but gradually escalated into something more systematic and cruel. Sergeant Davis, a career Marine who had never seen combat himself but commanded respect due to his years of service, seemed to take particular pleasure in undermining Sarah's confidence. During morning formations, he would make comments about Marines who couldn't keep up with their duties due to their limitations. When assigning tasks, he would often give Sarah desk work or other duties that kept her away from the more active assignments she preferred. The other Marines in the unit took their cues from Davis's behavior. Some began referring to Sarah as Limping Martinez when they thought she couldn't hear them. Others would exaggerate their own minor aches and pains, saying things like, "Oh, my back hurts, guess I need to get wounded in combat to get some sympathy around here." These comments were always made just quietly enough that Sarah couldn't directly confront them without seeming oversensitive or paranoid. Private Johnson, a young Marine who had joined the unit while Sarah was recovering from her injuries, seemed particularly eager to prove his own toughness by diminishing hers. He would make comments about how real Marines push through pain without complaining, clearly directed at Sarah's efforts to manage her ongoing discomfort. When Sarah would take her prescribed pain medication, Johnson would stage whispered conversations about Marines who needed drugs to do their jobs. The harassment extended beyond verbal comments to more concrete actions designed to make Sarah's life difficult. Her gear would mysteriously go missing before important exercises, forcing her to scramble to find replacements. Someone would accidentally bump into her injured leg during formations, causing her to stumble and drawing attention to her disability. Important messages about schedule changes or assignment modifications would somehow fail to reach her, leaving her looking unprepared and unprofessional. Sarah's attempts to address these issues through proper channels met with limited success. When she spoke to Sergeant Davis about the harassment, he would claim ignorance and suggest that she might be misinterpreting normal military camaraderie. He would remind her that the Marines were a tough organization and that everyone needed to develop thick skin to succeed. The implication was clear: if Sarah couldn't handle some good-natured ribbing, maybe she didn't belong in the Marines after all. The psychological toll of this constant harassment began to wear on Sarah's mental health. She found herself becoming increasingly isolated from her unit, eating meals alone and avoiding social gatherings where she might become the target of more cruel jokes. Her sleep became fitful and interrupted, partly due to physical pain but increasingly due to anxiety and stress about facing another day of subtle torment from her supposed brothers and sisters in arms. Despite these challenges, Sarah continued to excel at her assigned duties. She approached every task with the same dedication and professionalism that had marked her service from the beginning. Her work was consistently rated as exemplary by her supervisors, and she continued to score well on physical fitness tests despite her limitations. But her achievements seemed to make the harassment worse rather than better, as if her success was an affront to those who believed she didn't belong. The situation reached a new low during a unit training exercise designed to test combat readiness. Sarah was assigned to a team responsible for establishing a defensive perimeter around a simulated forward operating base. As the team moved into position, several Marines began making comments about how they hoped they wouldn't have to carry anyone who couldn't keep up. The remarks were clearly directed at Sarah, though they were phrased as general observations about team readiness. During the exercise, Sarah's team came under simulated enemy attack. As they maneuvered to respond to the threat, Private Johnson deliberately positioned himself so that Sarah would have to cross directly in front of him to reach her assigned position. As she moved past him, he stuck out his foot, causing her to trip and fall hard on her injured leg. The pain was excruciating, but Sarah forced herself to get up and continue with the exercise. Johnson immediately began loudly expressing concern for Sarah's well-being, asking if she was hurt and suggesting that maybe she should sit out the rest of the exercise. His false solicitude was clearly intended to draw attention to her fall and create the impression that she couldn't handle the physical demands of training. Other members of the team began making similar comments about the importance of knowing one's limitations and not putting others at risk by trying to do more than one was capable of. After the exercise, Sarah's leg was swollen and throbbing with pain worse than she had experienced since her initial injury. She managed to maintain her composure during the debrief, but once she was alone, she broke down in tears. The physical pain was bad enough, but the emotional anguish of being deliberately injured by someone who was supposed to be her teammate was almost unbearable. She began to seriously consider whether staying in the Marines was worth this kind of treatment. The harassment continued to escalate over the following weeks. Someone began leaving articles about military disability benefits on Sarah's desk, highlighting sections about medical retirement for Marines who could no longer perform their duties. Anonymous notes appeared in her locker suggesting that she should do the honorable thing and resign rather than continue to be a burden on her unit. The messages were never signed and always carefully worded to avoid explicit threats while still conveying their hostile intent. Sergeant Davis's behavior became increasingly brazen as he realized that Sarah was unlikely to file formal complaints that might damage her own career prospects. During weapons training, he would position Sarah in ways that required her to put maximum stress on her injured leg, then criticize her performance when pain affected her accuracy. He began scheduling her for duties that required extensive standing or walking, claiming that he was helping her build back her strength and endurance. The other Marines in the unit began to follow Davis's lead more openly. They would mimic Sarah's slight limp when they thought she wasn't looking, exaggerating it into a grotesque parody of her gait. During unit runs, some Marines would deliberately slow down when passing her, making comments about how they didn't want to leave anyone behind. These actions were always performed with exaggerated concern and helpfulness, making it difficult for Sarah to object without seeming ungrateful. Private Johnson took the harassment to new levels of cruelty. He began referring to Sarah's combat injuries as her little ouchie and suggesting that she had probably hurt herself worse getting out of bed than she had in actual combat. He would make elaborate shows of concern whenever Sarah showed any sign of discomfort, loudly asking if she needed to see the medic or take a rest break. His false solicitude was more humiliating than outright hostility would have been. The breaking point came during a unit ceremony honoring Marines who had been wounded in combat. Sarah had been selected to receive a Purple Heart for her injuries, a recognition she had initially felt proud to accept. However, as the ceremony approached, the harassment from her unit intensified. Marines began making jokes about how easy it was to get medals these days, suggesting that anyone who stubbed their toe in a combat zone could expect to be decorated for their sacrifice. On the morning of the ceremony, Sarah discovered that someone had placed a children's band-aid on her locker with a note suggesting that this was more appropriate recognition for her injuries. The band-aid featured cartoon characters and bright colors, clearly intended to trivialize her combat wounds and the recognition she was receiving. The message was unmistakable: her fellow Marines viewed her Purple Heart as undeserved and her injuries as insignificant. During the ceremony itself, Sarah maintained her military bearing and accepted her award with dignity. But she could hear whispered comments and see smirks from some members of her unit as she stood at attention while the citation was read. The words describing her courage under fire and her dedication to her fellow Marines seemed to ring hollow when the very people she had served alongside were mocking her sacrifice even as it was being formally recognized. After the ceremony, the harassment took on a new dimension. Marines began making exaggerated salutes when they passed Sarah, supposedly showing respect for her Purple Heart but actually mocking the recognition she had received. Someone began leaving toy medals on her desk, cheap plastic awards that looked like children's prizes. The message was clear: in their view, Sarah's Purple Heart was as meaningless as a participation trophy. The psychological pressure of constant harassment began to affect Sarah's performance in ways that her physical injuries never had. She found herself second-guessing decisions that she would have made confidently before, wondering whether her judgment was being clouded by stress and depression. Her appetite disappeared, and she began losing weight that she could ill afford to lose given her ongoing physical recovery. Sarah's family began to notice changes in her voice during their weekly phone calls. Her mother, who had always been sensitive to her daughter's moods, repeatedly asked if everything was all right at the base. Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell her parents about the harassment she was experiencing, knowing that it would only add to their worries about her military service. Instead, she made excuses about being busy with training and assured them that everything was fine. The isolation Sarah felt became almost complete. She had once enjoyed strong friendships with several Marines in her unit, but those relationships had been poisoned by the atmosphere of harassment and hostility. Marines who had once respected her began to distance themselves, either because they had bought into the narrative that she was a liability or because they feared becoming targets themselves if they were seen as supporting her. As the harassment continued month after month, Sarah began to seriously consider requesting a transfer to another unit. However, she knew that such a request would require her to explain the reasons for wanting to leave, and she feared that filing complaints about harassment would only confirm the stereotype that women couldn't handle military service. She also worried that the harassment would follow her to any new assignment, as military personnel moved frequently between units and carried their reputations with them. The announcement that General Patricia Thompson would be conducting a surprise inspection of Camp Pendleton sent ripples of anxiety throughout the base. General Thompson was known as a no-nonsense leader who had risen through the ranks during a time when opportunities for women in the military were severely limited. She had broken numerous barriers throughout her career and was respected throughout the Corps for her tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to her Marines. Sarah had heard stories about General Thompson throughout her military career. The general had been one of the first women to serve in certain combat support roles and had distinguished herself during multiple deployments. She was known for her keen eye for detail and her ability to quickly assess the true state of any unit she visited. More importantly, she had a reputation for protecting Marines who were being unfairly treated while holding accountable those who failed to maintain proper standards. The news of the inspection sent Sergeant Davis into a frenzy of preparation. He began drilling the unit on proper procedures and appearance standards, determined to ensure that his Marines would make a good impression on such a high-ranking visitor. However, his preparations also included increased harassment of Sarah, as he seemed to view her as a potential source of embarrassment that needed to be controlled or hidden. In the days leading up to the inspection, Davis made it clear that he expected Sarah to maintain a low profile during the general's visit. He assigned her to duties that would keep her away from the main areas where the inspection would take place, ostensibly to prevent any incidents that might reflect poorly on the unit. The other Marines understood the implied message: Sarah's presence was seen as a liability that could damage the unit's reputation. Private Johnson and his followers interpreted Davis's behavior as permission to escalate their harassment in the final days before the inspection. They began making increasingly crude jokes about Sarah's injuries and her fitness for duty. Someone left a fake medical discharge letter on her desk, complete with official-looking letterhead and language about Marines who were no longer able to meet the physical demands of military service. The harassment reached a new low when someone vandalized Sarah's dress uniform, which she had carefully prepared for the inspection. The jacket had been subtly altered so that it no longer fit properly, and small tears had been made in inconspicuous places that would only become obvious when she moved. The damage was done in such a way that it would appear to be the result of poor maintenance rather than deliberate sabotage, making it impossible for Sarah to prove what had really happened. On the morning of the inspection, Sarah arrived early to discover the damage to her uniform. With no time to obtain a replacement and no way to repair the damage, she faced the prospect of appearing before a general while wearing a uniform that made her look unprofessional and careless. The psychological impact of this final insult was devastating, confirming her feeling that she was fighting a battle she could never win. General Thompson arrived at the base with minimal fanfare, as was her custom. She preferred surprise inspections because they revealed the true state of military units rather than the carefully orchestrated presentations that formal visits often produced. She began her tour with a review of personnel records and training reports, looking for patterns that might indicate problems within the command structure. As the general moved through the base, she made seemingly casual observations that demonstrated her deep understanding of military culture and human nature. She noticed subtle signs of tension within units, inconsistencies between official reports and actual conditions, and the small details that revealed how Marines really felt about their service. Her decades of experience had taught her to look beyond surface appearances to identify the underlying issues that affected unit morale and effectiveness. When General Thompson reached Sarah's unit, she immediately sensed an atmosphere of tension that went beyond normal inspection nervousness. The Marines seemed uncomfortable in a way that suggested internal problems rather than simply anxiety about being evaluated by a senior officer. She made a mental note to investigate further while continuing her formal review of the unit's operations and readiness. During the personnel inspection, General Thompson's trained eye immediately noticed the damage to Sarah's uniform. However, rather than simply noting a discrepancy, she observed Sarah's obvious distress and the barely concealed smirks on the faces of some other Marines. The general's extensive experience with military culture told her that this was likely not a case of simple negligence but rather evidence of a more serious problem. As the inspection continued, General Thompson began asking pointed questions about unit cohesion and morale. Her queries were carefully crafted to elicit information about how Marines supported each other and whether everyone felt valued as part of the team. The responses she received were technically correct but lacked the genuine enthusiasm and camaraderie that characterized well-functioning units. When the general reached Sarah in the inspection line, she paused longer than she had with other Marines. She examined the Purple Heart ribbon on Sarah's uniform and asked about her combat experience. Sarah's responses were professional and concise, but General Thompson could hear the underlying strain in her voice. More importantly, she noticed the reactions of other Marines, particularly Sergeant Davis's obvious discomfort with the general's attention to Sarah. After completing the formal inspection, General Thompson requested private meetings with several Marines, including Sarah. This was not unusual during inspections, as senior officers often used these conversations to gather additional information about unit conditions and morale. However, the general's selection of interview subjects was carefully calculated based on her observations during the formal review. In her private meeting with Sarah, General Thompson created an environment where honest communication was possible. She began by acknowledging Sarah's combat record and expressing respect for her service and sacrifice. Then, she asked direct questions about Sarah's experience since returning from deployment and whether she felt fully supported by her unit and chain of command. Initially, Sarah was reluctant to discuss the harassment she had been experiencing. Military culture emphasized loyalty to one's unit and chain of command, and speaking negatively about fellow Marines felt like a betrayal of those values. However, General Thompson's gentle but persistent questioning gradually broke through Sarah's reservations, and she began to describe the systematic campaign of harassment she had endured. As Sarah's story unfolded, General Thompson's expression grew increasingly grave. She had suspected that something was wrong based on her observations during the inspection, but the scope and duration of the harassment Sarah described was far worse than she had imagined. The general took detailed notes and asked specific questions about incidents, witnesses, and the response of the chain of command to any complaints Sarah had made. When Sarah finished her account, General Thompson sat in silence for several moments, processing what she had heard. Then, she made it clear that the behavior Sarah had described was completely unacceptable and contrary to everything the Marine Corps stood for. She assured Sarah that immediate action would be taken to address the situation and that there would be consequences for everyone involved in the harassment. General Thompson's next meeting was with Sergeant Davis, and her approach was markedly different. Rather than the respectful tone she had used with Sarah, the general's demeanor was ice-cold and professional. She confronted Davis with specific allegations about his role in creating and perpetuating a hostile environment within his unit. Davis's attempts to deny or minimize the issues only served to further anger the general. The general's investigation expanded to include interviews with other Marines in the unit. Some initially tried to downplay the harassment or claim ignorance about what had been happening. However, General Thompson's reputation for uncovering the truth and her skillful questioning techniques gradually revealed the full extent of the systematic campaign against Sarah. Several Marines eventually provided corroborating testimony about incidents they had witnessed. Private Johnson's interview with the general was particularly revealing. His obvious hostility toward Sarah and his crude attempts to justify his behavior only served to confirm the seriousness of the situation. When confronted with specific allegations about his role in harassing a combat-wounded Marine, Johnson's responses revealed both his ignorance and his complete lack of understanding about the values the Marine Corps was supposed to represent. As the scope of the harassment became clear, General Thompson's anger grew. She had served during an era when women in the military faced significant challenges, but she had never encountered such systematic and cruel treatment of a decorated combat veteran. The fact that Sarah's own unit was targeting her because of wounds she had received while serving alongside them represented a fundamental betrayal of military values.
The general's response was swift and comprehensive.
She immediately ordered changes in the unit's leadership structure, removing Sergeant Davis from his position and initiating formal investigations that would likely end several military careers. She also ordered additional training for the entire unit on military values, respect for fellow service members, and the proper treatment of wounded veterans. For Private Johnson and several others who had been identified as primary perpetrators of the harassment, the consequences were severe. They faced formal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for their conduct. The general made it clear that the Marine Corps had no place for individuals who would attack their own wounded comrades, and that such behavior was inconsistent with continued military service. General Thompson also took immediate steps to ensure Sarah's safety and well-being. She arranged for Sarah to be transferred to a different unit where she could serve without fear of continued harassment. Additionally, she connected Sarah with resources for dealing with the psychological trauma she had experienced, recognizing that the harassment might have been even more damaging than her original combat injuries. In her final address to the unit, General Thompson spoke with controlled fury about the behavior she had uncovered. She reminded the Marines about the values they had sworn to uphold and the obligation they had to support their fellow service members, especially those who had been wounded in service to their country. Her words left no doubt that such behavior would never be tolerated under her command. The general's intervention had immediate and lasting effects throughout the base. Word spread quickly about what had happened to Sarah's unit and the consequences faced by those involved in harassing her. The message was clear: the Marine Corps would not tolerate the mistreatment of any Marine, regardless of gender or perceived limitations. This sent a powerful signal to other units about acceptable behavior and proper treatment of all service members. Sarah's transfer to her new unit marked the beginning of a new chapter in her military career. Under leadership that valued her contributions and respected her sacrifice, she was able to rebuild her confidence and continue her service effectively. The harassment she had endured left lasting scars, but General Thompson's intervention had validated her worth as a Marine and restored her faith in the values the Corps was supposed to represent. In the years that followed, Sarah's story became part of military training programs designed to prevent harassment and promote inclusive leadership. Her courage in speaking out, combined with General Thompson's decisive action, helped create a safer environment for all Marines. The incident served as a powerful reminder that true military strength comes from unity and mutual support, not from attacking one's own wounded comrades. General Thompson's reputation was further enhanced by her handling of the situation. Her ability to quickly identify and address serious problems within military units became legendary, and her protection of vulnerable Marines inspired loyalty throughout her command. The incident demonstrated that effective leadership requires both the wisdom to see problems and the courage to address them decisively, regardless of the personal cost to those responsible for creating those problems.